Hello everyone, my name is Andie and I am the co-director for Nature Advocacy on the Executive Board for Student Sustainability Council here at UNLV. And today I'm here to reflect and, collect my thoughts on my experience for the AASHE conference that I had the pleasure of attending this past month, October 2020. And while this year is very different in my experience of attending this conference online, compared to the conference I attended in 2019 in Spokane, Washington, it still definitely was very impactful and a really good use of my time. Regardless if I got to travel to a new place or not, I still learned a great many deal of things, and I'd like to thank Student Sustainability Council for extending the offer for me to attend this conference again this year. And I guess we'll get started. I'm going to go through my presentation that I typed up regarding, the overlying themes of the conference, went over, and, as far as what I learned, my experiences, and favorite sessions. Also, feel free to, watch the entire video, as I'm sure I and Sustainability Council would love that you, hear my experience. However, I do know it's going to be quite a long video, so I will include the slideshow in the description below if you, don't want to watch the full thing, but I'll go ahead and get started. Alright, and here's the first slide on my presentation, thoughts on AASHE 2020. I also think I forgot to mention at the beginning, the AASHE conference stands for the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education. So here's a full list of all the sessions that I attended. One of the things that I think I liked the most about this online format is that I wasn't really restricted to having to choose between one session or another session that was being held at the same time, because recordings were being offered for, this entire conference. So I was able to attend a lot more sessions this time around than I was the, last year in 2019. And the only thing that I think I missed out on by attending live sessions is obviously being able to attend live discussions. But, depending on what the conference is like next year, whether it's online or not, I think I forgot that it was on Eastern time instead of Pacific time. So, I got in front of my computer at the right time that I needed to, and then only to realize that the session had already been recorded and had already happened because it was on Eastern time. So that was a little bit difficult to figure out. So most of the sessions I attended were from recordings that I watched. So I'm not going to read through all of these because there's a lot of them, but you can see them here. I guess I'll just outline first, the sessions that made an impact, and you'll hear about those in my presentation. I picked 3. Alright, so here was my favorite session that I attended, and it was from UC Berkeley of California, and it was called Learning from Nature to Become a Better Change Maker. And this whole session was structured around this book, Emergent Strategy, by Adrienne Maree Brown, who is a women's rights activist and Black feminist. And she describes in the book Emergent Strategy as plans of action and collective organizing tools that account for constant change and rely on the strength of relationship for adaptation, with a crush on biomimicry and permaculture. And I especially like that last sentence. I should probably get it embroidered on a pillow or something. But from the summary of the session, here's what they had to say about this session. It says that this session explores how sustainability staff can think more critically about how natural systems can inspire the framework for environmental and social justice movements through using examples from the book Emergent Strategy to illustrate how sustainability teams can learn from nature to become better change makers on their campus. So basically, the way that they structured this presentation is they gave us, I think, 4 examples of, different natural themes, in the natural world that can be applied to social work and racial justice movements. The first would be interconnectedness, and I think from my title for this club, everyone can understand that I love nature, so that's why I really liked this presentation, because it was able to connect these things that leaders should have in sustainability movements and racial justice movements in the form of, natural things. So this first one, interconnectedness, is represented by a mushroom, and more specifically mycelium, which, you can kind of think as a mushroom's root system almost, to make it better. But so they said mycelium is the largest organization on Earth. Its focus is interconnectedness, remediation, and detoxification, decomposition. And UC Berkeley had their own example for this. They have this thing on their campus called Eco Leaders, which is an organization comprised of leaders either from environmental or sustainable clubs, or leaders looking to make a difference in improving sustainability on their campus, which I thought was really cool, because only just last year, Student Sustainability Council was maybe a part of a total of 4 other clubs that were, environmentally, sustainably minded. And now, there are at least 2 more clubs that have popped up this year during, this whole pandemic. So I think it would all be great if we were able to collaborate with one another. And that's one of the roles, well, that's kind of what I've adopted my role for Sustainability Council is, I'm also on the executive board for 2 other environmental organizations, Rebel Roots UNLV Garden Club and Ecology, Conservation, and Evolution Club. And part of my role for nature advocacy is not only advocating for nature, but also to bring these clubs together. So being on the executive board for all of these clubs, allows me to have my own little interconnectedness between them, but, I can't be on the executive board for all the clubs. The second one was cooperation, and they used ants to represent this because, with ants, they work together. They're of one mindset to, survive and to get things done. So they define this as, involves cooperative work, collective sustainability, mutual benefit, collective community care, shared leadership and vision, and mutual reliance. And here's where I'd like to bring up the example of, a garden club or a community garden again, because, when it's functioning properly, everyone should be cooperating to make sure that a garden or a vision or whatever it is you're trying to think of, is treated with care and is treated with respect. And that's definitely something that I'm speaking for Garden Club as the president, that we're going to need to work on that a whole lot more once it's safe to be together again, because, when we don't cooperate, things don't work out. All right, second, or I guess third theme that they talked about were the use of fractals. And they used this example of fractals to represent in shells or ferns, because, with these types of systems, they involve small-scale solutions that impact the whole system at a larger scale, working and trusting with others, to form a collective and collaborative ideation. And it asks us to consider things on an individual, relationship, community, and society level. Small-scale solutions that build it up. And then the fourth and final key that they brought up was the term of decentralization. And they used dandelions to represent this one, because dandelions are aggressively removed, or it takes a lot to remove them, hard to uproot and resilient, and they are thought of as a weed, but are actually so much more. They are so abundant, they're very nutritious, so not what you'd normally expect. and this involves interdependence, resistance, regeneration, and resilience. And they included self-care as a form of community care, and the importance of asking for help as a leader. And that's definitely some things that, I feel like I need to work on, not having to be the center of every single different change and realizing that there are people around you to help and that it's not all on your shoulders to, do everything. All right, and here are 2 points I wanted to make about what I learned from this conference the most. All right, so one of the sessions I attended was very eye-opening, and we will go back to talk about it, but the first major theme that was apparent this year are the ways in which Black and Indigenous people of color and their communities are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. All right, so here is the session down here that I attended that talked about that. The session was called What's Missing? The Invisible Impact of COVID-19 on Communities of Color. And the main researcher that was presenting her ideas and her research, her name is Aliana Lynch, and she is a senior research manager at SDSN. And from the session, I was able to learn that, this type of study was the first known attempt to leverage the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals to create accountability for racial inequity in the United States. And here is the report of the, the research that she's talking about, and SDSN stands for the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. So if you've ever been to any of Sustainability Council's meetings, you've probably seen this before, and I hope you've all seen it by now, but here are the Sustainable Development Goals put out by the United Nations, as something that we're supposed to strive to. And so the research they did in the session, they did they tried to calculate racial data for every single one of these and, produce their findings to show how people of color are disproportionately affected by these, and therefore how, it should be impossible to talk about sustainability without also including Black and Indigenous peoples of color underneath that whole umbrella. And let's see, maybe I have that here. I'm going to talk about this first. So here, she expressed the idea of racial data gaps and limitations, and how, they tried to do statistics for every single one of the Sustainable Development Goals, but due to racial data gaps and limitations, they might not have been able to include all of these in their research, either that they couldn't find data on it or there wasn't a way that the data could be documented. It's a terrifyingly large task to take on for the entirety of U.S. to be able to crunch these numbers and stuff. And so they have a list of all of these things that they, weren't really able to track down and quantify. So yeah, there was lots of things that they weren't able to account for. And from the summary of this presentation, they said, leaving no one behind is the first priority of the Sustainable Development Goals. It is an action agenda, and it means that to address the patterns of exclusion, privilege, and unjust power relations that can recycle advantage and disadvantage from one generation to the next. The case study of COVID-19 is an example of how these inequalities demonstrated throughout the report impact daily life and ultimately increase death. And there cannot be a full repair of the harms done through social, economic, gender, or environmental violence if there is not a full record of who was harmed and how. The cracks exposed by COVID-19 represent much deeper chasms in society overall. The full accounting of unequal treatment is not possible due to gaps in racial data in areas ranging from life expectancy to maternal mortality to food insecurity to environmental justice, which is what I talked about on this slide. And moving on, they were able to identify through the study 5 areas of the greatest disparity in Black and Indigenous people and their communities. And so these 5 were justice, food and housing security, education, economic security, and COVID-19. And these are represented by the Sustainable Development Goals 1 to 11 for food and housing security, 4 for quality education, 3 for good health and well-being for COVID, 8 decent work and economic growth as economic security, and 16 for peace, justice, and strong institutions. And across the board, they found that Black and brown people of color are disproportionately affected by these sustainability development goals 1 to 3 times more than white people in the U.S. All right, and then 2 of these that they presented the most information on was obviously the coronavirus, which is a major theme for this year's AASHE conference, as well as social justice as well. I'm sure all of you understand the stuff that's happened this year. So anyway, for coronavirus, they found that it connected to the other 4 sustainable development goals mentioned, because historically disadvantaged groups are experiencing infection and death at disproportionately higher for their share of the total population, and that Black people are dying at 2.4 times the rate and represent 13% of total deaths in the United States. And the reason it relates to the other 4 sustainable development goals mentioned is because they all tie in together and each one affects the other. And then the second one is for justice, because it is impossible to separate the U.S. criminal justice system from a long history of systemic racism. And examples of this are, but not limited to, the historical precedent regarding slavery, Jim Crow segregation, and the continuous violation of indigenous sovereignty, and continual institutional racism in the form of excessive use of force and police brutality, drug arrests, excessive traffic stops and excessive drug arrests, and the high incarceration rates of Black and Indigenous people of color. And that can all be seen, highlighted by the social justice movement of this past year. And obviously, it's been going on for hundreds of years, but recently, this past year, has kind of boiled over. So it was kind of impossible for the conference to not address that. And the second thing was that of environmental racism. And one of the other sessions that I attended that I will talk about is the keynote from Professor Ibram Kendi from Boston University, and he addresses this in this keynote speech with Kimberly Smith from AASHE, where he defines racism. Before identifying how racism and sustainability are connected, one must first define what racism is and how to be collectively anti-racist. So here is like a compare and contrast between, what he defined racism and what it means to be anti-racist. And a lot of the things about, what he was saying for racism kind of surprised me because, it's really an all or nothing system. You cannot, saying on the right, I have, saying that you are not a racist doesn't really mean anything, because leaders of the KKK, several white supremacists have said this same statement, and it doesn't really hold any, you have to say that I am actively anti-racist. And what this means, obviously, it's the opposite of racist, and it means to express anti-racist ideas and support anti-racist policies. And Kendi emphasizes that, it's actively seeking to undermine the status quo. And on the left, you can see that, the status quo is inherently systemic. It's a powerful collection of policies that lead to racial inequities, which, are substantiated by current racism, and where it's substantiated by white supremacy. And that is the status quo. So to be effectively anti-racist, you have to actively, actively seek to challenge the system. And that also means, you have to challenge the status quo. And to be anti-racist, Kendi says, is, inherently anti-capitalist. And so therefore, to see the connections between capitalism and racism and sustainability, you can see that these things are all connected. And Kendi emphasizes as well that, racism and capitalism emerged in the same time and place. In 16th century Europe, they developed similarly because through slavery and the transatlantic slave trade and settler colonialism, that all fueled today's current economy, and it circulated the economy. And because of this, it led to disparities among Black people in the United States, where race and class are unable to be separated. And this also leads into sustainability. Because of capitalism, there is overconsumption and leads to the pollution of air and water, soil degradation and deforestation, and the destruction of biodiversity. So all of these colonial ideas, they are all connected, and therefore you cannot have sustainability without deconstructing these systems. So from all the previous stuff that we have discussed, two things come out. We have environmental racism and environmental justice, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But environmental racism refers to the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color. And environmental racism refers to the institutional rules, regulations, policies, or government and corporate decisions that deliberately target certain communities for locally undesirable land uses and lax enforcement of zoning and environmental laws, resulting in communities being disproportionately exposed to toxic and hazardous waste based upon race. And down in the left corner, bottom corner, you can see this is the source I got this information from that helped me, put a definition to these themes that I was seeing emerge. And from environmental racism, these things are also connected with colonization, eco-fascism. They're all packed into an ugly racist bow, because racism, capitalism, colonialism, they're all intertwined. And, without understanding how to conquer these systems and get rid of them, we also need to, know what to replace them with. And, colonization is defined as when a dominant group or system takes and exploits and extracts lands and its native peoples, causing irreparable damage and generational trauma, such as the genocide of indigenous peoples that have taken place in the United States. And along with the theme of eco-fascism, which is an ideology that blames the demise and environment, of the environment on overpopulation, immigration, and over-industrialization, and it puts the blame on marginalized communities instead of those who have the power in this country. And to counteract these, underneath eco-fascism, is the term of resiliency. And, this past year, as a white person, I had to get over the fear, that I'm going to say or do something wrong in order to have conversations regarding race in this country, and realizing that even if I do say something wrong, Ibram Kendi also addresses that, to have the courage to get over your privilege and learn something and sit there with the discomfort of being wrong, it's not as bad as compared to this discomfort that Black and Indigenous people of color face every single day in the United States. And so to counteract this, we'll also talk about environmental justice as it relates to intersectional environmentalism, which is an inclusive version of environmentalism that advocates for both the protection of people and the planet. It identifies the ways in which injustices happening to marginalized communities and the earth are interconnected. It brings injustices done to the most vulnerable communities and the earth to the forefront and does not minimize or silence social inequality. And it advocates for the people and the planet. And, environmental justice, it refers to the cultural norms, values, rules, and regulations, behaviors, policies, and decisions to support sustainability and, how it merges with sustainability, where all people can hold with confidence that the community and natural environment is safe and productive. Environmental justice is realized when all people can realize their highest potential without the interruption by environmental racism or racial inequality. And I wanted to go back to talk about underneath the definition of sustainability and its connection with capitalism. As we've discussed that, and I've learned that racism, capitalism, colonialism, and sustainability, they're all intertwined. We need to then move the definition of sustainability over, to being, instead of all of those things, it needs to be anti-racist, decolonized, and, we need to focus on how to move from a linear economy to a circular economy. But, in this circular economy, it doesn't even include social justice into that definition. So we must also include social justice in a circular economy, because you cannot have a circular economy without social justice and radical change. And intersectional environmentalism, like we've discussed before. And from the other important definitions and themes on here, as I've talked about for decolonization, to challenge and change white superiority and, the nationalistic history, and historically defined truth, and not a history, of denial as racism and, that relates to. And so you can see that the major themes for AASHE this year was COVID-19 and its relation to racism. And so after all of the, what I learned out of the way, my final thoughts on the conference, the online AASHE format, like I talked before about, how I liked that I could still watch the videos whenever I wanted. The conference also talked a lot about how to, experience burnout and, make it easier for yourself. And I'll go back to the sessions that talked about this. Yeah, so you can see that, let's see, the ones that I attended that relate to this were don't just do something, sit there, the role of meditation in mobilizing a just transition. And also the one that I talked about with my favorite session from Emergent Strategy, it addressed it with everything that we've been trying to get done this year in regards to, social justice and radical movements, that there's a lot of burnout that's being experienced, and that's something that I've been experiencing on a personal level as well in regards to, I wanted to be this leader for my environmental clubs that just did things and put myself out there during, the pandemic and everything, but, I was just really burnt out, and it's okay to be kind to yourself and forgive yourself, and pat yourself on the back for all the work that you've done before and all the work that you have the potential for doing. And, if anything, the past AASHE conference in 2019, it was also in October, and, towards the end of the year, these conferences always give me hope, because even though they're held at the end of the year, they give you hope for what's to come, and that there's always room for change, there's always time for change. And another thing that I thought about the AASHE, is it made me really think about, how I should update, expand, and develop my LinkedIn profile, because, with everyone going into quarantine, when people search your name up for any networking or jobs, from one of the sessions I attended on green career planning, I'll go back to that session list. It was, where was it? Green Career Planning Workshop with the National Wildlife Federation. They were saying that, if they search your name and they don't see a LinkedIn profile, that they're just going to move on to the next candidate. And, it also made me think that I really need to work on my networking skills because the online format definitely makes that hard. But all in all, like I said, I believe that the AASHE was a very worthwhile experience this year, and it gives me a whole other year to make sure that my LinkedIn is in tip-top shape and that, hopefully I get better at my networking skills. But yeah, that was a lot to digest and a lot to digest in a couple sessions as well. So you can see with specific slides that I did, make yourself do extra research. Like, if anything, the AASHE conference just gives you the want to go out and search for more knowledge. And, part of what Kendi was saying about being anti-racist is, you have to actively be learning and countering racist systems and not just, like, I'm not just going to do this PowerPoint presentation and be like, all right, that's my work for the year, So it's the constant learning battle that we all should be doing, and I look forward to see what AASHE is going to be like next year, because as much as the common theme for racism and environmental justice was the norm for this conference, like I really hope that they don't just go back to not doing any sessions on this, because there was maybe only one session regarding Black and Indigenous people of color in 2019 and how or why we should incorporate them into the discussion, and it's like that's not the conversation we should be having. Like, the fact that we even have to have that conversation means something's wrong, and it was the only session being offered. And I would also like to see for next year for them to focus a lot more on Indigenous peoples, because I didn't see. Yeah, that's my thoughts on AASHE.